Tutti gli stati, tutti i domini che hanno avuto e hanno imperio sopra gli uomini sono stati e sono o repubbliche o principati. So runs the first sentence of the first chapter of the first book of Machiavelli's mature political theory. And Machiavelli uses the opening of The Prince to broach a theory of the state which forms the backbone of all his subsequent political thinking. That theory is famously bipartite. The division of all states into two basic types, principalities and republics, remains a constant feature of Machiavelli's work. We find it continuing to structure his thinking in his discourse on Florentine affairs of 1520-21, in which he reiterates that no stable state can be ordered which is not either a true principality or a true republic. Well, it's worth recalling that Machiavelli's first book of political theory was not conceived primarily as a work about the qualities of a princely ruler. Machiavelli himself describes his own aims in a famous letter of December 1513 to Francesco Vettori. He has, he says, composed a little book on principalities, in which he hopes to delve as deeply as he can in thinking about this subject, disputing what a principality is, what species there are, how they're acquired, how they're maintained, why they are lost. So note three things about this description. First, the work was initially entitled De Principatibus. It is intended to be a study of a type of state. Secondly, Machiavelli's disputing what sort of state a principality is and how it can be acquired and kept. And he will repeatedly insist on his work's controversial character. Lastly, he declares that he's interested in what a principality is and what species there are. Well, in the heading of chapter 1, we read how many genera of principalities there are. Well, that terminology of genus and species tells us something about the character of Machiavelli's undertaking. An important part of Machiavelli's philosophy is concerned with what we call things. These are questions of definition. They initiate inquiries into the qualities of objects, and in pursuing these considerations, Machiavelli generates a sharpened political vocabulary upon which he wants us to rely when thinking about the government of states. Well, his description of those qualities comprising virtu in the central chapters of The Prince clearly exemplifies this tendency. But the work as a whole is an extended act of redefinition. And in chapter 1 of The Prince, Machiavelli lays out a summary of his general argument in very specific terms that make this fact clear. He also organizes his definition in a very revealing way. Machiavelli has a characteristic method of ramifying his arguments through successive divisions. And this is a striking feature of chapter 1 in particular, and this procedure shows the debt which his political philosophy owes to the Roman ars rhetorica, the art of rhetoric, which forms such a crucial part of the kind of basic humanist education that Machiavelli received. The Roman rhetorical theorists insist that division is an essential instrument when giving a definition of something or someone. When we define something, we try and say what something is. And that task usually involves specifying what that thing's characteristic qualities are, what sort of thing it is. But doing that, the theorists tell us, in turn requires differentiating principles in order to separate off one thing from another when giving complex definitions, and so arrive at a thing's distinctive properties. So it's a theory about definition which uses conceptual tools called divisio and differentia, division and difference. And furthermore, both Cicero and Quintilian stress that we can build classificatory schemes and definitions by using the ideas of genus and species to group and divide things. Now, both these terms are treated by the rhetoricians as highly elastic. Cicero points out that often the same thing is a genus in relation to one thing and a species in relation to another. Man, he says, is a species of animal, but a genus of which Thebans or Trojans are species. And that fluidity appears to hold true in Machiavelli's use of the terminology. The principality is one of two species of state, but it's also a genus which can itself be subdivided into various species. And that is precisely what Machiavelli proceeds to do through the rest of chapter 1 by means of division and differentiation. Well, one benefit of identifying these rather technical elements in Machiavelli's opening chapter as part of a distinctive apparatus of definition is that we really have to call, I think, into question the dominant scholarly orthodoxy of the last half century or so, which holds that Machiavelli is not possessed of a coherent concept of lo Stato, never mind a fully developed theory about it. That view, I think, is demonstrably wrong. Lo Stato is very clearly Machiavelli's master noun, and is so of all his political theory, the nodal point, we might say, of his principal lines of inquiry about liberty and servitude, about empire, about corruption, and so on. And he could scarcely be more concerned to define what it is. Now, it's certainly true that lo Stato was not a new item in Florentine political vocabulary, but it is the first noun we meet in Machiavelli's work, and we subsequently encounter lo Stato in its various forms 114 times in Il Principe. So in terms of sheer frequency of occurrence, Machiavelli's reliance on the term in this very brief text alone is quite incomparable in early 16th century political writing. And in the Discorsi, where Machiavelli focuses his attention on the Republic, the occurrences multiply massively. It's also true that Machiavelli has various ways of thinking about the state. But the conceptualization which dominates this definition is that of a body. This much becomes immediately evident in chapter 1, when he tells us that new principalities are either completely new, or else they are like limbs joined to the hereditary state of the ruler who annexes them. And thenceforth, the image gathers increasing complexity. By the close of chapter 3, the allegory of the state as a body is well underway, and by the close of the text, that body has acquired not just humours and appetites, but also nerves and even needs. In the Discorsi, we see three distinctive developments of this account at the start of each of its three books. Book 1's opening chapter speaks of the birth of Rome, and in chapter 11, Rome is called the daughter of Romulus, to whom she is said to owe her birth and her education. Now, that language of parenthood and nurture is crucial to Machiavelli's theory. It helps him explain the benevolence involved in this initial relationship of domination. The state's outstandingly creative founding father nurtures the young state, ordering it to conform to behaviors which help it develop its liberty, even if it cannot be said yet to enjoy the fully flourishing vivere libero, free way of life, as Machiavelli calls it, that justifies the title of republic. Free way of life is not spontaneous for Machiavelli. It's an historically staggered process. Well, in Book 2, a second refinement is a closer attention to the relationship between the body of the state and the bodies of those over whom it extends its rule. And here the processes of acquistare, ampliare, and fare imperio, at the core of Machiavelli's theory of empire, are couched in the language of incorporation. So chapter 2 states that the aim of a republic is to deprive all other bodies of their vitality and to weaken them in order to increase its own body. We're presented throughout the book with an image of a demanding larger body, sapping the strength of those bodies under its command. And in Book 3, we have the description of the state's proneness to corruption as a type of degenerative disease. Organisms which do not let their bodies become disordered, but maintain them in an orderly way, usually complete their allotted time on earth, says Machiavelli. Bodies such as republics, he contends, are better ordered and have a longer life if their ordini make frequent renovation possible. The theory of the free state is thus articulated as an extended life cycle to talk of the state's parentage, its birth, its growth, its expansion, and its subsequent decline in health or its renewal through intervention. Now here you might say Machiavelli's merely developing the classical metaphor of his sources in typical Renaissance style. After all, Machiavelli's staring at Livy's account of the generation and growth of what Cicero had called in the De Officiis the corpus Republicae, the body of the Republic. And that corpus is firmly established in Livy's first book. Romulus imposes legislation upon the Romans since, as he says, nothing else but law could unite them into a body politic. We find that same image underpinning Sallust's massively influential account of the growth and corruption of the Roman Respublica in his Catiline, and in Seneca's theory of princely government in De Clementia, our earliest surviving text explicitly describing itself as a mirror for the prince, we find the same image extended in almost baroque levels of complexity. So what's new, you might say, about Machiavelli's idea? Well, it's certainly the case that Machiavelli wants to monopolize this classical image in his theory of the state, and in so doing, his work embodies a fundamental semantic shift in the word Stato, which we see occurring elsewhere. So rather than referring to the state or condition or even constitution of a political body, which is an impeccably classical usage adopted by Renaissance writers, the word begins to refer to the body politic itself. For Machiavelli, as for later early modern theorists, the state is a type of civil body over which the power of sovereign command, or imperio, is exercised. Machiavelli will also establish a pattern followed by these theorists in treating Stato as a synonym of civitas in Machiavelli's Italian città. But Machiavelli's description of the principality redefines it in two main ways. Well, the first is to do with its content. Machiavelli's account of what's inside this body and how it should be ordered is riveted to an entirely novel and highly controversial political ontology, which was certainly not endorsed by later theorists. And the second new thing lies in the state or condition in which this kind of state is said to reside. And this is supplied by the principle of differentiation, which separates the principality from a republic that Machiavelli gives us in chapter 1. The differential of his binary division in his definition comes when he tells us that states thus acquired are either used to living under a prince or used to being free. So the difference between a principality and a republic is that a state that lives under a prince is not free. Liberty is the property of a republic and not of a principality. There is no trace of freedom in Machiavelli's principalities in the prince. So whatever benefits of living in a monarchy there may be, and certainly Machiavelli thinks there are some, liberty is not said to be one of them, at least in this text. Now, Renaissance Republican humanists since the 1370s have been alleging that Julius Caesar had been responsible for enslaving the Roman Republic and that to live under a prince was to live in a state of servitude, of unfreedom. But Machiavelli actually sits down to theorize this contention deep within the humanist literature on princely government. And that is, I think, breathtaking. From the Roman to the French revolutions, the pivotal claim of monarchical political ideology is supplied by the ultimately Augustan contention that the installation of a prince at the head of the body politic was the best way of preserving both the republic and its liberty. Machiavelli is making it clear from chapter 1 that this is categorically not the case. From chapter 2 onwards, he gives us ample evidence to prove this point.